Welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee in our first session of our brand new inquiry into the civil service in Scotland, Intergovernmental Relations Civil Service. And we have two distinguished guests who will give us some background to the conversations, debates that are currently in place about the arrangement. So we'll start with Mr. Parry. If you could please introduce yourself, who you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Mr. Parry.
Thank you. I'm Richard Parry. I'm an honorary fellow at the University of Edinburgh in the School of Social and Political Science, and I suppose I'm here because I've been an academic researcher on civil service and devolution for a very long time.
Thank you. Mr. Rycroft.
Thank you very much, Chair. So Philip Rycroft, I was a civil servant for coming up 30 years, 20 years in the Scottish context for the Scottish Office, and then Scottish Executive and Scottish Government, and then I spent the last 10 years or so in Whitehall, where from mid-2012 till early 2019, I ran something, I was responsible for constitution and devolution issues, first in the Deputy Prime Minister's office, then in the Cabinet Office in the UK Governance Group. So this set of issues came within my remit through those 7 years.
Well, thank you both for coming to speak to us this afternoon and changing your arrangements to meet our requirements. Thank you for that. Well, let's get right to the heart of the matter then to get things started. We've got two governments, one civil service. How on earth does that work? Mr. Rycroft.
It works. In the 7 years that I dealt with many difficult issues at the interface between those governments, not least a referendum, and then Brexit, this was one issue that I didn't have to spend a lot of time on, despite the fact in the 2007 SNP manifesto for the Scottish Parliament elections there was a commitment to seek devolution of the civil service. But it was in many ways a dog that didn't bark. It didn't raise many controversial issues through my time. It was an arrangement that had obviously been in place since devolution, and there were a few challenges to it from within or without the system. So people just accepted this as part of the way things worked, and for the most part, it worked.
Yeah, that's your view. It works, and is this your considered opinion of the current arrangements just now? This is a thing we should leave alone, because I noted in Mr. Parry's evidence to us that there was a SNP commitment, wasn't there, in 2007, that we'd have similar arrangements to Northern Ireland, but that sort of hasn't been pursued or pushed with any great vigour.
I think in the grand scheme of things, with all the other problems that need sorted out, all the other issues around the relationship between the two governments, which is hugely important on a day-to-day basis, this is one which I don't think has disturbed the ability to transact that business. In preparation for coming to speak, I actually thought about it a little bit for first time for a little while, and you can see there are clearly some advantages in having a unified civil service in terms of, for example, civil servants from Scotland having access to training programmes. It underpins the arrangement whereby the permanent secretaries of the Scottish and the Welsh governments attend the so-called Wednesday morning colleagues meeting, which is the meeting in Whitehall of permanent secretaries. It should facilitate interchange because you have, at least at senior civil service level, a commonality of terms and conditions. But having thought about it, fine, that's all good and well, but then you look at the arrangements for our colleagues in the Northern Ireland Civil Service, of course, is a separate civil service, and their permanent secretary attends Wednesday morning colleagues. Their senior folk have access to interchange opportunities and training opportunities. So I suspect that the value of this arrangement is more symbolic and symbolic of the union than it is practical, because you could, through a separate arrangement, achieve many of those things. It's just one final point.
What you're telling this committee, the arrangements that we currently have in place for the civil service, and this one civil service serving two governments, is its symbolism, not its practicalities.
It has practical benefits, as I've outlined, but I think those practical benefits, with a will, could be replicated in a different system, as indeed they are with the Northern Ireland Civil Service. It would be very odd if the civil service was separate, that somehow Whitehall sort of turned again the civil servants from Scotland or Wales and didn't try and incorporate them into cross UK mechanisms. So, as I say, I think there is, it hasn't caused friction or strain for the most part, and I'm very aware there are some political issues out there right now about the how civil servants hold themselves north and south of the border. But in terms of the underpinning arrangement, as I say, it was not something that in my time in government, when I had some responsibility for dealing with these things, that it caused many issues.
And what's your view, Mr. Parry? What's the advantages and disadvantages of a unified civil service for Scotland's?
I would say that it's one of these features of the way of doing things in Britain, which works in practice but doesn't work in theory, and it's working in theory less and less well actually as the years go by, but it's still working pretty well in practice. What were the reasons for it? I'm just looking at the white paper before the devolution referendum in 1997. I was just looking at the arguments put. And two arguments were put. It will mean that Scotland, the new devolved system, will enjoy the highest standards of public administration, and all the good things about the civil service, which we've seen for 100 years in Scotland, would be perpetuated. Also said it would facilitate interchange, and you could easily, without any problems at all, move from a job in the UK government to a job in the devolved system. But actually, that wasn't the main argument that was put. If you read it, it said that terms and conditions of the civil servants, of the new then Scottish executive, would be in line with arrangements in the civil service management code. Therefore, they will be part of the Home Civil Service. And I do believe at the time, and I was doing interview research at the time, I even think with you, Philip, actually, and a big issue was what you do about terms and conditions issues, because all of the staff will say, what will happen to my job, my pay, my grading, my pensions, and to be able to say they won't change at all. That was a very easy thing to do at a time when all the other arrangements around the new Scottish Parliament were being made and everyone was getting very anxious. And the other thing, which everyone has kind of forgotten, but the first intention was there'd be a one-year handover period for the new system. The elections would be 1999. It would be the next year before it would actually take over. And that was the same arrangements as for local government reorganisation. They've just gone through one quite before that in the 1990s. And so there was going to be a whole year. Then there wasn't a year. There was from early May until the 1st of July. Every single thing had to be worked out then. So I think that was the reason at the time. Now, as Philip said, and as I think you've said, there was a commitment by the SNP that they would seek a civil service, a Scottish civil service, on the same model and lines as the Northern Ireland civil service. So that opens up the question of what is Northern Ireland able to do, which Scotland and Wales aren't able to do. And if actually Scotland and Wales can do almost everything that Northern Ireland does, there's no big deal on the issue. But there was a sort of sequence of events on this, because in 2010, for the first time ever, the position of the civil service was put into law for the first time under the Constitutional Governance and Reform Act that was passed by Gordon Brown's government just at the very end, actually, of that Parliament. And that said, the civil services of the Crown are the Home Civil Service, the Northern Ireland Service, the Diplomatic Service, and that kind of thing. Now, that would have been an obvious opportunity if the SNP government had wanted to make progress on the issue. They did actually have to give legislative consent to that bill, which they did. And they actually, I think they were asked at the time, that they said, no, we are still looking at this issue of the civil service. We're working on it with the UK government. It's a very complex issue, and we're still working on it, and we aren't saying that this bill should be a vehicle for it. And actually, they were saying everything's working fine. And in that same year, in 2010, we had the very dramatic thing that the new permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government was an import from England, from Whitehall, on a transfer, on a completely level transfer. And I believe you had Alec Salmon with you a month or two back, and he said, I was told by the head of civil service that this guy, Sir Peter Howson, was the most wonderful civil servant on earth. And well, maybe, I don't know. But once Alex Salmon, and people like John Swinney, actually, who did the talks with the civil service just before the 2007 elections in Scotland, they were working with the civil service and everything was working well. So I suspect that it was an instant in history when the SNP were interested in this proposition, and once they found they didn't need to take it further, that was the end of it, and it hasn't been mentioned in any SNP manifestos after that.
What you're both saying to us is the fact that Northern Ireland has got this different and distinct civil service where we've got an arrangement where we share a civil service across two governments makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. Would our colleagues from Northern Ireland possibly tell us the same thing?
It's not absolutely true. I mean, one thing about Northern Ireland is that they still have their own civil service commissioners. There is in GB the Civil Service Commission, which oversees all the appointments and the procedures and how posts are advertised and the role played by ministers. Quite an important thing like that. But there's also the Northern Ireland Civil Service Commissioners. There are 3 of them, and they aren't devolved. They are appointed on the nomination of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and they do the same kind of thing. So that immediately begs the question, if there were to be a separate Scottish service, would it use the existing Civil Service Commission, which might suggest there's hardly any change, or would it need its own, and would they end up doing all the same thing? I mean, one thing which is important is that in Wales and Scotland now, through 1 or 2 changes that have happened since 1997, there isn't any role of the UK Prime Minister in the appointment of senior civil servants. There's no role at all, absolutely no role at all. So one thing that was argued that perhaps the UK government might wish to put their own people in, as it were. This really hasn't happened, I suspect.
Colleagues from Northern Ireland might grumble from time to time they don't get the sort of access they wish to in Whitehall. They may say that they're not told about stuff when they want to, and they may look jealously at their Scottish and Welsh colleagues and assume that they're getting better access. But then I think if you talk to civil servants from Scotland and Wales, they'll probably tell you that they struggle with that as well. The deeper issue, in a way, is that the way that Whitehall manages relations with the devolved parts of the UK as a whole. I don't think the unified civil service, it doesn't get in the way of that. It may be at the margins a benefit to it. You could argue that the fact this change wasn't made early on sort of confirmed in the Whitehall mind that Whitehall didn't need to do a lot of adjusting to accommodate devolution, because these people who they'd worked with in the pre-devolution days, still part of the unified civil service, so the world was continuing to turn as they were used to. In fact, the world had changed pretty dramatically with devolution, and the story of the last 25 years from a Whitehall perspective, which I was very involved in as part of my job to encourage Whitehall to understand what was going on in devolution, is Whitehall catching up with what has been a momentous change in the governance of the UK. So the fact it didn't happen then, you didn't have that sort of shock. These people from henceforth are going to sit in rather different space. But as I say, I think the bigger issue is the learning of Whitehall about devolution, the politics of devolution, and how to amend their own practices to accommodate the changes that have come consequent on devolution.
On that, you have served in both Scotland
Yes.
and in UK as a senior civil service. What do you know about the differences in arrangements and working practices and cultures?
Well, I'm still living. I was an example of interchange. So I came south in 2009 on secondment from the then Scottish government to work in the Department for Innovation, University and Skills, which lasted for about 5 weeks after my arrival, but I was subsequently then worked in the business department. I then left the civil service. When I rejoined, I came in as a cabinet office official, so no longer on secondment. So I have direct experience of the possibilities, but also of the hindrances to that sort of interchange. It's actually quite difficult to do. In my case, it meant my family were not prepared to move south. My older boy said if Dad's going to London, he's going on his own. So that was the end of that argument. So I commuted for as long as it turned out. I ended up commuting for about 10 years or so. And you've got all the differential of schooling and housing and so on. it's not actually that easy to have those longer-term secondments or exchanges as people tend to assume.
What was a better experience in Scotland or the UK?
Oh, in terms of working, I loved working in both Edinburgh and in London.
There's
so
a politician's
there we go.
answer as well as a civil servant.
Yeah, and they're very different. I mean, a serious answer to that is they are very different experiences. I have said to many people who sought my advice on if they want thinking about maybe moving from Whitehall to Edinburgh, to say that in a devolved context, you early on in your career, you have far better oversight of a broader policy domain because there are fewer of them. But certainly in areas like health education or the devolved areas, the policy responsibilities are very similar. So you get a broader experience. You can see how government works across the piece better. And I think that actually is very, very valuable experience for Whitehall folk whose careers can get rather locked into narrow stovepipes. But Whitehall was fun as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for being here today. Can I, Professor Parry, get a little bit of clarity around, so in Northern Ireland the commissioners are appointed by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is what you said. Yes. So potentially if we did, or if there was a decision to move in terms of an independent civil service for Scotland, and there was commissioners, the expectation would be that that would be mirrored from a Scottish perspective, that it would be the Secretary of State for Scotland who would appoint those commissioners as opposed to the First Minister. Would that be your understanding?
Yes, I suppose so. Or you could still use the Civil Service Commission as it is, and understanding it was working to more than one civil service. Because all the other civil services, the diplomatic service is quite interesting because, in fact, I believe that more than half of the employees of the present Foreign Office and Development aren't actually in the diplomatic service since they absorbed overseas development, so many of them. So there's quite an interesting question here. Who is in charge of the diplomatic service? Is it the Foreign Secretary who actually does choose the head of the diplomatic service? So I think there's all sorts of models you could use. The interesting thing about the three Northern Ireland committees, they're all female, and along with a female head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and a female First Minister and a female Deputy First Minister
as well, yes.
Everybody in the system who's choosing all these grey people to be civil servants, well, they certainly aren't grey men themselves. So perhaps that might be quite interesting. And the civil service from Northern Ireland aren't ex-civil servants at all, actually. And that's a bit of an issue in the UK Civil Service Commission. You may know that quite a lot of them in the past have been ex-senior civil servants. So I think all sorts of models would be possible, but asking the question does very much point up, if you wanted to make this change, you would spend a lot of time thinking about everything, and it would be an unproductive, I suspect.
And I suppose my question is then, given that the template was the fact that the decision was made in 1921 for Northern Ireland to have a separate civil service, what was the reasoning behind not having separate civil services when devolution took place? Because obviously, if you were looking for consistency, there was a clear decision not to provide that back when devolution happened. I
think there's an answer to that which would have been given by the Cabinet Office, and was given, I think, in their evidence to the Kalman Commission in 2008, and they said we only had a Northern Ireland civil service because we had an Irish civil service before that, and if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have needed to have the Northern Ireland civil service. Now that's a kind of clever answer, if you like, which doesn't really resolve what the issue is. The other interesting thing is that the recent report by Francis Maud, Lord Maud, his independent review of governance and accountability in the civil service, which was issued last year, he says it should be the one way or the other. He can't see why it should be one system for Northern Ireland and a different system for Scotland and Wales, and it should be either the one or the other. He said this isn't actually argued through, but this was a senior Conservative politician asked to look at the civil service from the outside, so it's kind of worth reading on that point of view. So yes, and of course everything to do with Northern Ireland, you can always say Northern Ireland is a very unusual and unique system.
Well, I think what's become very clear already from the evidence is that politics does play a part in these decision makings, and it did so in 1921 and it did so in 97-99 as well. Now, the House of Lords Constitution Committee last year actually said it's important that the principle of a single civil service across England, Wales and Scotland is maintained. But it sounds to me from the evidence so far is that there doesn't actually seem to be a huge inherent difference or improvement. Would that be fair?
I think that is fair, though change, of course, comes with costs. So if it's working and it's functioning perfectly adequately, those who wish to make the change have to, in a sense, argue that through and what benefits change would bring. And of course, in any change, you have all the questions that Richard's adumbrated about how you would manage appointments to the civil service, how you would govern it. And I suppose for nervous folk across the country, they would worry perhaps that the verities of the Civil Service Code would somehow shift in relation to civil servants serving a government in Scotland or in Wales. And that there is some reassurance in a unified civil service and that all civil servants are bound by the same code. But of course, that makes the assumption that a government in Scotland or in Wales would wish to move away from those sorts of standards, and that wherein probably lies the politics of this.
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose in terms of if we were looking at consistency, as Lord Maud said, the reality of the politics is the consistency would be to move the Scotland and Wales setups, not to change Northern Ireland. Let's be honest about that.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think the trying to shift the status of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, which has been hallowed by many decades of usage, as it were, in the context and all that, I think would be, personally, I think that would be a wrong track to go down. As I say, I'm not sitting here urging change particularly. I think, as I say, I think to me the issue remains perhaps more of why more use isn't made of the potentialities of the unified civil service in terms of that. I think that the big issue for me, when we come on to it later on, but how do you facilitate essentially working across the border where policies impact on populations east, west, north, south, and how do you ensure that the civil servants who are tasked with managing those policies have the right capabilities and skills and experience and indeed political understanding to do that effectively.
Okay. Thank you very much. So other than the commissioners and obviously the UK Cabinet Secretary managing the Scottish Permanent Secretary, are there any other ways that Whitehall has oversight of Scottish Government officials?
No, as it says, I was responsible for this for quite a long time. I did not spend much of my time worrying about it. I think the key elements of this, of course, if we haven't discussed much, is that Cabinet Secretary is the line manager of the Permanent Secretary in the Scottish Government and ditto for the Welsh Government. And that clearly is a very important relationship. And that relationship over the appointment to that post, where the final decision following a Civil Service Commission process, those who get above the line, but the final choice rests with the respective First Ministers. Okay. But it is important to that, so that therefore that relationship, the Cabinet Secretary to First Minister relationship, is actually a rather important one.
Yeah, it's like a kind of matrix management, isn't it? Where you've got obviously a line management through the Cabinet Secretary, but you're actually the day-to-day is via the First Minister. And
given where the candidates are going to come from for those posts, so the Richard has already set out what happened in 2010 when Peter Housen came from a Permanent Secretary job here to take up that post in Scotland, and the current Permanent Secretary in Scotland also came from a Whitehall context. So in terms of that senior appointment, and indeed at the Director General level, having a Cabinet Secretary able to facilitate those, support those appointments in an atmosphere of trust with the First Minister is really very important indeed.
And I suppose my question therefore is, are either of you aware of that ever being an issue or there ever being a conflict?
Without sort of going into too much of the sort of what might, probably should remain for the Records Office in due course, but in my experience, that relationship was handled very adroitly with due respect and understanding, even through the tough times of you couldn't get tougher than a referendum campaign where the two governments were taking opposite sides on the issue. But
political leadership in relation to that was part of it, wasn't it?
Indeed, you needed, absolutely. If the politicians hadn't been willing to play in that space, it could have got really very difficult indeed. And don't forget, there was plenty of folk outside the system who were putting pressure on that. So it withstood that pressure, partly because both on the civil service side, but credit also to the politicians involved, that there was no wish to make it a campaigning issue.
I think one thing which was an accident of history was that 1 year before devolution, the civil service had really reconfigured into the senior civil service, which is the top 4 grades: permanent secretary, deputy secretary, under secretary, assistant secretary, now called permanent secretary, director general, director, deputy director. But that's the concept. They were separated, as it were, from the other grades. So the senior civil service is still looked after by the Cabinet Office. The senior civil servants have an individual contract, and the scales of pay is done under job evaluation procedures and so on. So the very curious thing is that the Northern Ireland Civil Service chose to join the senior civil service idea. So they organised their senior jobs in the same way. So in other words, I suspect because under devolution you can prove that your job is a big and important job, actually. You've got a bigger span of responsibility. So we've got the senior civil service. Within the senior service, the top 2 grades are the top 200, so-called, the permanent secretary and the directors general, and there is a kind of career planning thing. There's a thing called the Senior Leadership Committee, which has some senior permanent secretaries on it, and we learnt last week who they were, I think actually for the first time, in fact, and they kind of plan the thing, in the old-fashioned way. So there's that. But then everything else, other than the senior civil service, the great majority of grades were, in 1996, delegated to departments. Whitehall departments, Scotland and Wales, all the same, so they can organise it exactly as they want, the grades, the pay, the recruitment, if it's in line with the Civil Service Code, and the Civil Service Management Code, which is a much longer document which goes into dismissal procedures and holidays. And remember, they've got the same trade unions, so it's very important as an integrative. Can
I just ask, I'm struggling to find out what added value the Cabinet Secretary brings to managing the Permanent Secretary of Scotland. How does that management, how does it manifest itself?
Well, I suppose the most important consequence of it is that the Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government has a person up above them, basically, and so that fulfills the line of management idea, and of course it's an access route for the Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government into the UK Civil Service and the UK Government. As the head of the Northern Ireland Service is able to attend these Wednesday morning meetings, indeed, and sometimes will, but it's not as. It isn't as intimate, and we have this curious sort of relationships here. The First Minister directly with the head of the Civil Service, and then the Permanent Secretary, and when there's a new Permanent Secretary, the first Civil Service Commissioner is in on the thing in a big way as well. So we have these people who kind of have a personal. They are big actors, basically. All of them are big actors, and they kind of have a sociological mechanism also, almost, which I suppose...
Like a Sir Humphrey menage a trois, perhaps?
Well, yes, and if it didn't work, but I suspect it probably is working.
No, the mind boggles, Chair. It is a personal relationship, clearly, because the lines of political authority go in separate directions. But I wasn't Permanent Secretary in Scotland or Wales, or indeed Northern Ireland, so I can't speak from personal experience in that space. But I can see the value of having a relationship with somebody who's a Cabinet Secretary who's got that different set of experience, is managing the wider entity, as somebody to share issues with, to use for coaching, mentoring, and those sorts of purposes. And absolutely see the utility of that. Would the world fall over if that wasn't available? You'd hope not. But that's the system that we have. And what I saw over the years was that system working. You don't forget, it's not just in the Wednesday morning colleagues that there is interaction with the senior colleagues from the Scottish and Welsh governments. It happens a lot. We were seeing a lot of them, for example, through the Brexit time, and no doubt that was replicated through COVID time.
I mean, my initial thought is without that link, potentially then you are relying on the politicians overall, aren't you? So, you know, it's that concrete connection.
But don't forget the current arrangement, you can't take the politicians out of the mix. If you had a situation where the Cabinet Secretary was saying, I think the performance of one of these other permanent secretaries was inadequate, but the respective First Minister says, I don't agree with you, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it is by dint, I think, of the building of those relationships, and particularly trusting relationships, that we haven't encountered those sorts of difficulties. But you could, you know, if you had a different system where you didn't have a unified civil service, maybe it would give more latitude to a cabinet secretary to say that he or she was not content with the way that things were being managed in a devolved administration, a devolved government. But we don't, you know, we've never been in that space, so we don't know what that would look like.
It would be, for me, a politicisation almost. Yeah.
So much of this is premised on what one's understanding is of how the politicians in the devolved governments would manage.
Can I ask one last question, Chair, before I hand back then? And has that, in either of your views, evolved given the fact that devolution has evolved in the last 25 years? And I'm thinking particularly of the fact that, you know, there has been more powers devolved to Scotland.
In my personal experience, of course, there's been a change. If you go back to when I joined the Scottish office, a lot of folk from Edinburgh, Cardiff spent a lot of time here because all the legislation went through Westminster. So there was a lot more up and down to manage the legislative programme, and people inevitably built up understandings and relationships with their colleagues in Whitehall. Inevitably, over time, that has attenuated as the legislatures have gone about their business in Cardiff and in Edinburgh. And there are fewer people now who've had that sort of experience. In fact, they're more or less coming to the end of people's career who senior level, who had senior level experience before devolution. So the understanding of what it means to work in Edinburgh, Cardiff, in a way that has to be constantly refreshed, and vice versa as well. The folk who work in Edinburgh and Cardiff need to put the effort in to understand how their colleagues in Whitehall function. You just can't take that for granted anymore, and that is such an important part of this picture.
I think a big thing was when the two SNP First Ministers decided that their new permanent secretary would be a person from England who'd never been in Scotland before. I mean, that is quite extraordinary in a way when you think about it. In each case, Peter Housden was an existing permanent secretary. So it was said at the time, the Scottish Government briefed, he's a big guy, we want a big guy for a big job, sort of thing. And then Nicola Sturgeon chose John Paul Marks under the new regime where the First Minister does have the last word, can choose between the candidates considered worthy of appointment, which was not the case before. And she chose John Paul Marks, who was in the Department for Work and Pensions, very much working on the new social security matters which are being devolved. Now, once the SNP said, we're going to bring in someone from the outside, then I think it really changed things, because the whole system worked, and the outcome of the system was that it, like it was an import. Now that's happening in all walks of life, import, and it's a wonderful feature of Scotland. Coming from Wales, I can tell it's a wonderful feature of Scotland that people can come in from outside, and they're very much welcomed into the biggest jobs. And it's not like an SNP First Minister say, I want this person who I know from Scottish local government, or that sort of thing. Didn't happen like that way at all. And I think it was because they could see, Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon could see that this job is not a means of control from the UK onto Scotland. It's a channel of influence from Scotland into the UK, and it could be useful.
So having a navigator that knows the territory is helpful.
Yes.
I think you're going to come back to me later. Thanks very much, Chair.
Very interesting. Thank you. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. Mr Rycroft, can I start with you? Obviously, today is a big day with the infected blood inquiry, and some Scottish Office officials and ministers are criticised for, according to Sir Brian Langstaff, decision makers in Scotland knew there was a real risk, but due to a lack of knowledge, their response was insufficient and too slow. I know you joined the Scotland Office in 1989. During your entire time there, did this issue get raised? Were you involved in any way? Do you remember discussions about this either in the UK government or when you moved to the Scottish government?
The answer to that is no, because I was never in a policy area that touched on this. So if you look at my career, I started off ag, fish, European affairs, education, never industry transport. I did a lot, but never worked on the health side of things. So I was never crossed my radar screen, north or south.
So even as it became a bigger issue more recently, it never crossed.
No,
I'm not asking because
I mean it's a very fair question to ask, because it is it is one of those issues where there's going to be a lot of explaining to do. And absolutely rightly so. But it was not. I don't recall being party to any conversation. If I had been, it would have been in the context of other things. It was not part of my responsibilities at any time.
Thank you very much. You mentioned earlier that you're very aware political issues, how the civil servants hold themselves, is kind of coming to the fore. Do you want to describe that comment a bit more and your views on that?
Civil servants, I think, do have it's one of their core obligations to demonstrate their impartiality, and that is what underpins the constitutional status, such as of the civil service. So if that is challenged or been seen to be challenged, that is worrying for the integrity of the civil service over time. So this civil servants have their job to do in that, but the politicians they work for also have a duty in that space as well, not to put pressure on civil servants in a way that might transgress those boundaries.
And any recent examples that you've looked at that have concerned you or otherwise?
Well, I have been concerned about. I left the civil service in the end of March 2019, so I've been out for a little while. But so I am now, sort of watching this from the outside.
Potentially freer to comment as well. So.
Yes, indeed. So I have been concerned about the way that the debate, particularly around Brexit, has put pressure on the civil service, and we've seen quite a lot of instances where government has been in this Whitehall, Westminster has, for example, been pushing a line which might mean that the government is in transgression of its international legal obligations, and of course part of the Civil Service Code, part of that is respecting your international legal obligations. So when you move into that sort of territory as a former civil servant, that indeed does worry me.
And any concerns about the actions of the civil service in Scotland at the moment?
I think I can guess what you're driving at. So there is clearly an issue about whether the Scottish Government has the vires to commission work on what is a reserved issue, essentially a constitutional issue. That was something that we dealt with, of course, in the run-up to 2014 independence campaign, and there was a pressure actually on both civil services to whether that space was being, whether we'd gone over the boundaries of that space. And I'm aware that it is part of the political discourse now that there has been a stepping over that boundary.
Do you think it is a stepping over of the boundary?
I think there is an issue there, undoubtedly. And there's probably a legal issue there that I don't look to me to opine on that with authorities. I'm not a lawyer, and you're not asking me to do that. But the way I look at that, and I know one or two people have said the way that you deal with this is to put pressure on the Permanent Secretary in the Scottish Government via the management routes from the south, to either refuse to undertake that work or to seek a ministerial direction. I can understand why that is being proposed, but my personal view is that is the wrong way to sort the problem out. It would be potentially very destructive of the relationship between the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister, and indeed possibly the First Minister and the Permanent Secretary in Edinburgh. And so ultimately there is a risk there that it would impact good governance. So then the question then is there a problem? Yes. How do you sort that out? And that, I think, takes you more into political space. And there the question, I think, if I put it very straightforwardly, is if you have a government that is elected democratically, where clearly its key policy is to promote independence, should that government be not denied the opportunity to present to the public arguments that are supported by work done by civil servants that promote that policy? And I think that is a political question. And if the answer to that is actually democratic, that's a fair thing to expect, then the answer is you would have to change the Scotland Act to allow that to happen. But that argument, it seems to me, ought to engage in political space, and you as politicians, North and South, can come to your own conclusions. All I would say on that is that having watched a debate unfold on a referendum in 2014, when both sides put a lot of evidence in front of the public, it was contested evidence, inevitably, but you could argue that there was a balance of evidence there for the public then to make up its mind. We went through another referendum not so long since, where actually the different views were not, particularly on the Leave side, what would leaving the EU actually mean? There was never a clear proposition put in front of the public. And you can see the debilitating impact that has had on the body politic ever since. So
people would also say, I mean, if you're not suggesting, I don't think, that the white paper was actually so well written and evidence that had we voted for independence in 2014, oil would still be over $100 a barrel and paying for everything we were told it would pay for.
Of course, as I said, that was contested, but at least there was a document there to be contested. And that's my point. If the Scottish Government is putting forward its arguments now as to why Scotland would be better off being independent, those arguments are in the public debate. You hope that there is some substance in terms of the factual underpinnings of that, particularly if it's supported by civil service work. But then those arguments are in the public domain and can be contested. And that debate can go backwards and forward, informing the public view about the decision they make. So this, to my mind, it takes us quite a long way from the minutiae of management of the civil service onto a rather higher plane, it seems to me, about the engagement of a democratic process of debate to help people understand the constitutional choices they have before them. I was a member of the Independent Constitutional Commission for Wales, which reported earlier this year, and that in its own way sought to do that. We weren't taking a position on the constitutional future of Wales, but we were setting out some of the considerations that people in Wales should consider as they contemplated their possible futures. Not just now, but as the world changes around them and into the future. So my vote in all of this ultimately is for the informing of the public debate, and that to be done through the production of quality argumentation that people can make a judgment on.
Just to clarify what you've told us here, one, you believe there is a problem with the production of these papers and some of the debate around that. And secondly, you said if there was to be a route that doesn't lead to the Cabinet Secretary getting involved, the Permanent Secretary and written direction, it would be a change in the Scotland Act to allow them to do that. Therefore, and I know you're not a legal expert, are you saying the Scottish Government are acting out with the law with the current production of these papers?
I can't look at this and say there is the line in the Scotland Act. So I think there is indeed a problem. I think it would be very It would be very wrong to deny that.
If it means changing the law, you believe they are acting out with the current Scotland Act and therefore out with the law?
Yes, that is the implication of it. As I say, I'm not it's the sort of thing that should be put to lawyers, and doubtless the Scottish Government would have a counter view to that. But my point is that it's an issue that has been there essentially since there was a government in power in Scotland that wished to see alternative constitutional futures since 2007. And my point is that the resolution of that problem through a civil service management route, I think, is the wrong way to go about it. The fact that the issue has been there since 2007, it has been capable of resolution since then, suggests that quite a lot of folk have not looked at it and thought this is a major problem. If we're now getting to the point where there are those in the political world who think that it has reached a point that it needs resolution, my view, very strongly, would be that is resolved through political route, not through using the civil service route.
I want to come back to some other examples that we might touch on, but Mr Parry, you mentioned this in your written evidence the committee at point 24. You're discussing the issue flaring up in 22-23 with the appointment of a Minister for Independence and then the subsequent issuing of papers. So far, when you put in this evidence, it was 11, with a hiatus between October 2022 and June 2023, while the Supreme Court ruled on this issue. You then make the comparison that Mr Rycroft has just made about the referendum in 2014, when both governments published papers for their side of the argument. However, does that really stand up? Because in 2014, we had the agreement of the UK Parliament to hold a referendum, and the Scottish Government, and there was a joint agreement, the Edinburgh Agreement, it was the gold standard. The issuing of these papers came at a time, and some subsequently, when the Supreme Court had ruled it wasn't within the competence of the Scottish Government and Scottish ministers to pursue an independence strategy, and therefore nothing changed. The papers continued to be issued, and indeed until the recent reshuffle, the position of Minister for Independence was maintained. We've now been told, although that ministerial portfolio has gone, his roles and responsibilities will now be assumed by the Cabinet Secretary. So nothing has really changed, despite a Supreme Court ruling telling the Scottish Government they cannot legislate in this area.
It was interesting that the new First Minister decided to get rid of the two junior ministerial portfolios, which were dealing with the tricky areas, Europe International and Independence, and I wondered if that was an accident or was thought through or was a bid to defuse the situation. You're absolutely right that in 2014, when everyone wondered this is going to be really hard to deal with, how on earth can we have a civilised debate on an issue like this? They came up with it wasn't ingenious, because one lot of civil servants advised one side, the other lot of civil servants advised the other side, and they produced their own things, and that wasn't contested at all. And this has changed. The reason we've had these Building a New Scotland papers is actually, I would say, being a political scientist, I suppose that the SNP needed to have a suggestion of action, in a sense. What were they doing? Well, at least they were working on it, and they were producing these papers. Whether things changed in a big way after the Supreme Court's decision. Of course, it was the SNP's wish to have that decision. They wouldn't have needed to have it if they wanted to put a bill through first. But I don't think... my personal view on this, that we've been told for months now that the UK government is working on considering what further guidance may be needed to support and best practice and adjustments to the Civil Service Code. We haven't heard anything, and I don't have any idea what stage this debate is at, but I suspect they find it really difficult to draft it, actually, to try to put into words what they're trying to say. And I think it's not worth it, actually. It's not worth it, and these situations will be resolved in other ways. But B, I'm actually take the view that it's probably healthy rather than unhealthy for these things to be produced by the SNP government under civil service advice. And if you read Building a New Scotland, of course they're SNP, they are scenarios of how good things would be. But compared with the 2013 paper you mentioned, Scotland's Future, which was very much, will it be bad? No, it'll be wonderful. That was very much the contention. This is a bit more analytical. It is some analytical, it's harmless, I would say, in that kind of sense, and I'd be happier to have these sort of things done under civil service advice than just done by SNP channels. Whether you want to spend money on all the civil servants, over 20 of them on it, well, that's to some extent the way it's organised in government is the decision of the government. They can organise the government and civil service the way they want. But I do think there is a sort of channel here that you can only deal with independence-related issues in the context of is the devolved system working? Are the present powers working? Because if you say what's going to happen in independence, you have to say we aren't able to do A, B and C at the moment, but independent we might be able to. And then you really need the civil service to advise you what you can't do A, B and C at the moment. And I think that's the way I would see it. It's politically, of course, a rather tempting thing to sort of mix it on this. And I do agree that civil service has been put in a slightly different position, that this can be resolved through civil service channels. But I would take a benign view of the whole thing and hope that it would gradually defuse. We've reached the point where the last building in Scotland was Scotland's place in the world, right? We're talking about the world now. It's not outer space. That might be the 13th paper, but it's the world. And you could say, without actually saying it, we're not going to do, this work is going to slowly wind down, and we're not going to get worked up about it.
I suppose my points on this are twofold. One, there is a cost to this. There is a cost to the Scottish and UK taxpayer, because this civil servant time is not free, and I think many people in Scotland believe this is not a good use of taxpayers' money. But secondly, it's your point 25 in your evidence about a precedent having been set in 2014. I don't see that as a precedent, because we had a legally binding decision by both governments to hold a referendum, and both governments then producing these papers. Since then, we've had a decision of the Supreme Court that the Scottish Parliament does not have the powers to hold another referendum, yet we continue to have the Scottish Government publishing papers. And that's where I think the precedent doesn't exist. Would that be fair?
I would say on that one that people wondered what the role of the civil service in the independence referendum would be. And I think there was some feeling either that the civil service should be unionist in some kind of way, and the Home Civil Service as a unified entity was part of this, but also the civil service should be even-handed. And you could well have said in 2014 the Scottish Government civil servants had a duty to the people to be even-handed. Now, it didn't happen, they weren't even-handed, but of course their job is to support the government that they're working for, and it was handled by the civil servants of the UK government, putting the equal and opposite. So I do feel there was a certain precedent that if an SNP minister asks a civil servant, will you please work on independence and give me some arguments and look at the evidence and build up something for me as a draft, that it did set a kind of precedent that it wasn't an unreasonable thing to ask.
That's the job of the civil services, to serve the
would be
government of the day. If that's their objectives and that's their ambitions, that's a matter for the civil service to make sure that it's done to their best ability.
Even though it's impossible for that government to enact any of this, because there's been the Supreme Court ruling.
They can only take things forward with the consent of the UK government. And that, of course, is being withheld at the moment. And they might say, we hope it would not be withheld, after the general election stuff. And then in the meantime, we need to, be up to speed with what we aren't able to do at the moment, and changes in the EU stuff and all that. So I don't know. I mean, the internal organisation of the Scottish Government and what it's all paid for, that's really up to them. There's no UK control on the running costs of the Scottish Government within the overall budget. It's really the overall budget. And of course, it's a very good political argument for Conservatives to make, and they're making it clearly to say, look at what's going on, the things they are spending, and they could equally say they've got lots of civil servants working on this or that or the other thing.
Mr. Rycroft, can I come back to another example of potential conflict between civil servants and their impartial role, as they should always be. During the COVID pandemic in July 2020, a very senior Scottish Government official emailed ministers saying that imposing a quarantine on travellers from Spain would be seen as entirely political by the Spanish government. They continued, "They won't forget there is a real possibility they will never approve EU membership for an independent Scotland as a result. Is that the type of thing impartial civil servants during a pandemic should be discussing and proposing to ministers?
Without seeing the wider context, I'm not going to comment on the individual case because I don't understand the context of that.
Just to allow you to have more information, the government at the time, at UK level, had imposed a travel corridor. The Scottish Government then decided not to, hours after receiving this email from a very senior Scottish civil servant, the Director of External Affairs. They chose not to impose that travel corridor, and then a few days later, because of cases, had to impose it anyway. But a civil servant advising a minister in an impartial role was discussing the impact of that health decision and that travel corridor, and how that could then be viewed for their future success of getting support for an independent Scotland, if that were ever to be the case. How could that be defendable in any way?
Very often as a civil servant, you are put in a context where the ministers you're working for are thinking very politically. I worked in the Deputy Prime Minister's office for 3 years. I'm not a Liberal Democrat, never been a Liberal Democrat. He saw that as a big advantage that I wasn't a Liberal Democrat, because there was lots of Liberal Democrats around him who were giving him advice. But I needed to understand how he was thinking politically in order to give him my advice. Now, in a sort of cognate circumstance, perhaps my advice would have been, Deputy Prime Minister, you have a choice of paths to go down here. You could impose a travel ban, but you are aware that there is an issue with the Spanish government that they would likely to be that they would likely object to that. That's factual. That's perfect. And then you might then say, as your special advisors, you might want to talk to your special advisors about this, because there is a political dimension that I can't really discuss.
That's different. There are those two rules. So for the public watching this, the special advisors are appointed by the politicians, paid for by the taxpayer, but we understand that every government needs special advisors. For the rest of Parliament, for the rest of the government, for the public in Scotland, we have to trust that our civil servants act impartially. And I think there was a lot of concern in Scotland when these emails were finally released during the COVID inquiry, that an independent civil servant, someone at a very senior level in the Scottish Government, would suggest during a COVID pandemic that there are implications that could dent the aspirations of those who want to separate Scotland from the rest of the UK if a travel corridor was introduced.
I would be, one day, perhaps all of my emails will be in the public domain, where I was advising ministers in Whitehall through a referendum campaign and subsequently, and I'm absolutely no doubt at all, somewhere in there there'll be an email that somebody will pick up and say, you crossed the line,
Do you think this crossed the line?
I think in the way it was formulated, yes, it's not a careful use of language. You need to use language carefully. The fact that you're only giving me one example from what is a very, very fraught time, a very pressurised time in public policy, but the underlying question that you're driving at, so the implication of what I think you're driving at is somehow this cohort of civil servants have become politicised, that they have
this
lost...
individual civil servant had other issues, and I'm quite happy to go into that, but the chair may stop me.
Yeah,
but
I don't, and again, I don't want to individualise this, but that somehow the culture is such that they are now serving the ends of a political party, not the government of the day. Now, the test of that actually comes if there is a change in government in 2026 in Scotland, whether your party or the Labour Party or a coalition takes power in Scotland. Would you see a mass resignation of civil servants in Scotland, or would the vast majority of those civil servants loyally and properly serve the incoming government of the day? We are looking into a future which nobody can predict, but in my view, knowing a lot of those folk, they would loyally and properly serve the government of the day, just as will happen down here if there is a change of government later this year or early next. So there is something in all of this, I think, and it is just worth bearing in mind that when governments have been in, or political parties have been in power for a long time, habits and thoughts of mind, ways of speaking sink quite deep into the civil service psyche. You can see the same happening down here, the way that press releases are issued, tweets are sent out, that a lot of people think, is that pushing up to a crossing the boundary of what's
No, Mr.
appropriate?
Russell, got further questions, but just on this, because it's a really fascinating area to explore when it comes to the unitary service and the two governments that we started this very debate on. If a government's priority, quite clearly, Scottish National Party stated political ambition, is independence for Scotland, that is its intention, it surely must be right and appropriate that civil servants would work in order to not so much assist but ensure that that was a government view that would be part of the general thinking when policy was being developed. That would surely be appropriate.
What I experienced in 2014 was, of course, that absolutely happening, and you referenced the white paper. I mean, part of my job was to find as many holes in that white paper as I possibly could.
Your easier roles, I'm guessing. But just on the chairs...
Can I just finish the point? So, at the same time, we were publishing all of these analysis papers. Now, I would defend all of those papers, saying they were wholly accurate, but clearly my colleagues in the Scottish Government were examining those to see if they could find the gaps in them, and we came under pressure once or twice. That was part of the cut and thrust. But the point is, and I'm agreeing with you, Chair, here, that it is better that the public has those expositions, fallible as they are, and I would say that in that debate one was more fallible than the other, so I think you know where I'm coming from on that, but that it is better for the public to be so informed than not to be informed. I absolutely agree with you that there is a problem here. As I say, my argument is that it is a problem that should be addressed politically, and I think if the politicians, as you as politicians, put your hats on to think about this, you put your democratic hat on as well and think what's best for the people of Scotland, rather than just about...
Well, Scotland had just voted for a Scottish government that believed in the further referendum on Scottish independence, which was denied by the UK government. That is the basic democratic case. And is that part of the issue and difficulty we have here? There's what's in the Scotland Act, there's the laws and how that should be arranged, and then there's the democratic arrangements we have in a government.
This is fascinating territory. Of course, at the moment, there is no known route whereby a Scottish government, whatever the situation in terms of the electoral geometry, could move to a second referendum without, because the UK government has not set out formally the terms under which they would allow that. So there are, clearly there are a lot of issues around this, and those issues, in my view, so now 5 years out of civil service, so I'm free to speak my mind, these issues will persist as long as there is a substantial body of opinion in Scotland supportive of independence. We can't run away from that. And it seems to me that it is better that those who wish to preserve the Union take on those arguments in a sort of open, free, fair debate to seek to persuade more people in Scotland that actually that is the wrong road to go down. If you remember where we started off in the referendum campaign back in 2011-12, the opinion polls suggested there was only 33% of support for independence. It would be far more comfortable, I think, in all of these debates for those who are promoting the Union if we were back there, but we're not. We're still in the mid to high 40s. And so it seems to me that those who wish to promote the Union, the continuance of the Union, should have confidence in the quality of their arguments and to go toe-to-toe with the Scottish Government on what are obviously political arguments, there are arguments of emotion and sentiment, but there are also factual arguments. What's going to happen to trade? What's that going to happen to defence and all the rest of it? And obviously some very strong arguments there on the Union side of the debate.
So with the Chair's intervention, we've slightly moved away from where my question started. So just to go back to that, and the Chair's point that the civil service support the government of the day and their manifesto commitments. Now, the government were returned as a minority government, and we are seeing the repercussions of that. But in 2020, when this email was sent, we were in the middle of a pandemic. So surely at that point, when the leader of the government, the First Minister, was standing up daily saying, don't worry, I am not taking any partisan decisions. I am doing things in the best interests of keeping people safe and avoiding any constitutional battle or any party political debates and discussions that could be perceived that way. For an impartial civil servant to then insert a very partisan comment into an email and advice to ministers, that is different, I think, to what the Chair was describing about generally supporting a government and their manifesto commitments.
As I say, I don't want to litigate this one to endlessness. It is, as I've said...
You accept there's a difference?
I do, indeed I do accept there is a difference there. As I say, there for the grace of God, I said, I hope you don't apply the same sort of scrutiny to all my emails over time, because undoubtedly, in the heat of the moment, what the civil servant, because I don't know the circumstances, but in similar circumstances I've been in myself, you're short-circuiting what is a known set of arguments, and you know that there's going to be a political concern over here that you're saying...
That's the point he should have known there wasn't, because he was being told, like the rest of us, put all that to the back of your mind. We are not thinking about politics or independence or constitutional issues. We are thinking about keeping people safe. Yet still he emailed the First Minister and other senior ministers within the Scottish Government to say, hold on a second, you might not want to do that because in a few years' time, if we ever get independence, it could cause us trouble.
But again, the form in which it was said, there was a way that could have been expressed that wouldn't have exposed it to the ire that you clearly feel about it.
I think Mr. Rycroft did his best in answering that question.
Indeed, and I'm grateful for that. Well, can I come back to one of your other areas that you were heavily involved in, the UK governance group? Yes. And what you feel about that now, all these years on, and indeed the recent evidence from JP Marks to the Constitutional Affairs Select Committee earlier on this year. I'm not sure if you're aware. He said that it was your evidence, I think, to that group, that you mourned the loss of the UK governance group.
I do. So the history of this, for those who aren't familiar with it, but it emerged essentially out of the learnings of that Scottish referendum campaign, and the learning of that was the shallowness of the understanding of the governance of the United Kingdom in respect of devolution in Whitehall, and the arguments I made to Jeremy Hayward and he took to then Prime Minister Cameron was that we needed to establish a centre of authority, a centre of government, which would combine Scotland Office, Wales Office, Office for Advocate General for Scotland, and a Constitution Group in the Cabinet Office as a powerhouse of constitutional and devolution understanding, support for the Prime Minister and for the respective Secretaries of State. And we set that up, and we oversaw the Scotland Act 2016, the Wales Act 2017, introduction of English votes for English laws, and so on. That then came under the Brexit cosh, because clearly Brexit then subsumed many of those debates within the UK context. The point of setting it up was to build up this cadre of expertise, that people who would come into the governance group, maybe work there for 3 or 4 years, maybe then go out to departments, but taking that knowledge with them, maybe come back in again. So it was about building up that expertise. So have been sorry to see that has dissipated somewhat, and I think part of that
was... You think there's still a role for it, or has it...
Absolutely still a role for it, and it was partly the moving of these responsibilities into the Department for Levelling Up that broke that Cabinet Office nexus. These responsibilities, and I hope you as a committee might agree with me on this one, but they are so important to the future of the United Kingdom that you have at the centre of government the capability, the understanding, the experience to advise the Prime Minister on whether the UK Constitution, with a devolution, and that's what the UK Governance Group was set up to do. Because when the situation that we inherited in 2011-2012 was of a really weak understanding of these issues at the centre of government and in Whitehall more generally.
And Mr. Parry, Mr. Rycroft mentioned there about people coming into posts and that kind of osmosis of people moving around Scottish UK government. You mention in point 13 of your evidence, generally speaking, the second level posts, the Directors General, have been promoted from within. Do you think that's positive, negative? Do you have a view on that? 2
out of 8 of them entered from outside the civil service. The one doing economics, actually, both came in as economists. So the others have moved their way through. One point to make is that usually these days all the senior jobs are are open to being advertised. There's an open advertisement, so not only civil servants can apply. And there is a positive interest now in bringing people into senior posts who have had other kinds of experience rather than civil service experience. So the question is, are these jobs attractive to civil servants from elsewhere? Well, I think that they probably are, and there have been instances of not that many, but key jobs within the Scottish Government over the whole history of devolution have been filled from people from Whitehall, either because they've been heard of through civil service personnel channels, or they were just interested in the work. I think that's important. I mean, we have a thing about sick condiments being the thing, and they're being proposed now. I see the evidence of the UK government to you as being that they're still working on it. There's a working group on this. I think we've got to be very careful on secondments, because a secondment implies you're thinking not just of the reasons that you've come in, but where you will return to afterwards. You'll think of your job afterwards, and obviously home issues. Philip was mentioning those. So to think that it's an answer to get people in a different position for 2 years and then they return, I'm not sure if that's the complete answer, and I suspect the bigger answer is people saying, right, this is a great job in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, although it's not quite simple, but that there'd be a great job. And curiously, the one person who did say it's a great job was Sue Gray, who went to Northern Ireland as a permanent secretary of the Department of Finance there, and I'm not sure the reasoning for that, but she, as reported in the Northern Ireland media, was interviewed for the job of head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service with other Northern Ireland permanent secretaries, and they couldn't reach a decision, and it was re-advertised. But I think that kind of thing is interesting, and she was there for 3 years on secondment once again. So again, it was at the outer limit of the length of secondments, but it was a real job, and it was a big job, and I think that's the model that is preferable.
On point 7 of your evidence, you look at the effectiveness of working relationships and changes over time, and you largely focus on Brexit and the changes that has led to, and Mr Rycroft has done the same in his evidence today. Have you considered the recent Scottish Government legislation that has been passed by the Scottish Parliament, particularly when they had a majority with their coalition partners, the Greens, and particular legislation that has caused trouble between both governments, and indeed some of it has ended up in court? So if we look at the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, if we look at the Deposit Return Scheme, if we look at some of the issues around taxation and highly protected marine areas, there's been quite a lot of conflict in recent years, and I wonder how you viewed that from the outside in terms of not necessarily legislation coming from Westminster and covering Scotland, but actually Scottish legislation that has then fallen down when it's come to Westminster or indeed the courts.
There will always be issues where the Scottish Parliament wants.
There seems to have been a few more recently.
There have been more recently, and I think you can only look at them individual case by case. I mean, the gender recognition thing, that was an example. In fact, each of the two you mentioned, both the deposit return and protected marine, they're all kind of examples of questions of issues where the trend UK-wide appeared to be that way. Gender recognition reform may be necessary, may be a good thing, and then the deposit scheme, which is being introduced UK-wide in the end, so that was the UK-wide track we were on, protecting marine concern on that issue. So what seemed to happen was, and you will know a great deal about how it sort of turned in the heads of all the actors in the system, that what it seemed like relatively uncontroversial, MSPs of all parties were in favour, and then it suddenly turned into a very difficult issue to handle, which in the case of gender recognition led to the first use of Section 35 Scotland Act, which is an absolute veto by the UK government, actually, never been used, and because it was a veto, it could only be challenged by judicial review, which was really asking, was it wholly unreasonable? It wasn't like wholly unreasonable. It may have been an unwise action by the UK government, but it's one that could be defended, although I think the UK government kind of ended up arguing it would be a good thing if this was the same all through Britain, if we didn't have different laws. Now, whether
likewise with DRS, there were suggestions precisely. You could have a UK-wide scheme, but the theme here is Scotland wanting to do it slightly different, and then actually ending up, with legislation that was not compatible, and the issues that then leads to.
I would see it more as Scotland being on the leading edge of change in policy, a trend in policy. They've always wanted to be first. You know, it's quite important. So, like, you know, we can prove that devolution works because we can be first to do it. And in these cases, the Scottish Government didn't quite realise they had to bring UK government along with them.
Or industry, if we look at DRS in particular.
Yes, absolutely. So as an example of policy not being implemented very well for all sorts of reasons, and it's usually a great mix of reasons, actually. So I'm not the sort of generality of what you're asking, that over the whole ranges of issues, you know, this is something we can observe as a phenomenon. I'm actually not convinced. I think it's more that the Scottish Parliament and government always wanted to be a leader on a track of policy, which is happening anyway.
Mr. Rycroft, anything to add?
Both those episodes were not a great example of cross-government working, were they, to say the least of it. I think a lot in what Richard says. I think there was the Scottish Government, in a sense, you know, pushing ahead, using these as a sort of political wedge. I don't think it was in the interest of the UK government to go the extra mile to seek to accommodate that, so ended up with conflict. I think that was unfortunate. As you say, for business, but also the community affected by the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. I don't think it did anybody any favours that it fell apart so badly and with such discord. These things can be dealt with. There are lots and lots of cross-border issues that are dealt with by the respective governments on a day-to-day basis, some controversial and difficult. But they're done, you know, that's done through a recognition of mutual interest and getting things sorted out. I point you at the common frameworks, which emerged out of some controversy in the Brexit time, at the shape of the withdrawal legislation, but as a mechanism to resolve many of the issues that emerged once powers were repatriated from Brussels. You know, what the basis of that is that the government sit down, talk it through, work out where the respective interests lie, and try and reach a common way forward. That seems to me good government, and it's a shame that it broke down in these instances. I think you're absolutely right. Deposit return scheme, you could really only conceive of that on a UK-wide basis, the nature of the market. And gender recognition reform as well, that it would have been better done on a cross-UK basis. I have to say, in the same breath, I think the way in which the UK Internal Market Act was pushed forward and pushed through, it was a slightly a laying down of the gauntlet in terms of particularly powers to the UK government to spend money in devolved areas pretty much first time, but also the harmonisation and so on requirements that seemed to run counter to devolve responsibilities. And my argument about that was that bill necessary when you, or that is it now an act, when you had the common frameworks that could deal with the vast majority of these issues if there were cross-border consequences of pursuing different policy routes. Far better to go down the route of collaborative working than to go down a conflictual route. So I agree with the essence of what you're saying. It was both of those were both episodes which I don't think anybody will look back on and say any of the legislatures put forward their finest hour.
And a final question, if I can, to Mr. Parry. I've been doing some research into some of the other documents that you published, and you published an article in April 2012. I don't expect you to remember it verbatim. It was the Civil Service and Intergovernmental Relations in the Post-Devolution UK. Have you got a copy in your bag there?
I might have brought my entire yes.
Well, I will
magnum opus from about 40 years. No, not that was.
I will read out the bit I was wanting to ask you about. You say, in the longer term, the interdepartmental mode of working may be harder to sustain as operating procedures set up in a path-dependent way from before 1999 erode as more civil servants are externally recruited and contact with Whitehall departments is reduced. And then you conclude, it is even possible to envisage a reversal of the attitude in which the devolved administrations value the civil service link to Whitehall more than it does the UK government. I just wonder, 12 years on from writing that and significant changes at both the Scottish and a UK level, what your feelings are on that now?
Well, thank you for asking me this question. I think it's the first time ever that someone has referred back to such an old piece. And I think I did make the point earlier that what had looked like a channel of control had become a channel of influence. And I think I underestimated the extent to which things would really remain as they are. In fact, because I was a bit concerned that there was a generation of people, you know, like people like the first two permanent secretaries, Muir Russell, John Elvidge, who'd done the sort of very much Whitehall route. They'd spent 2 years in the Cabinet Office kind of stuff. And I rather suspect that as the years go by, people in the Scottish Government would only have worked there. Now, we had that with Leslie Evans, of course, who hadn't worked in Whitehall. We've reverted now to a permanent secretary who has worked in Whitehall. So my feeling is that things have held up reasonably well, and the issues which are kind of troubling us these days are not to do with the Home Civil Service, really. And I am quite impressed by the way that we have these meetings of the head of the Civil Service and the First Minister, you know, doing his annual appraisal and asking the First Minister, actually, is she or he actually helping you to fulfil the objectives of your government? Because that, of course, has become quite a theme now in Whitehall. The performance appraisals of senior officials are very much, are you delivering the political objectives of the government explicitly in a way we didn't have before? But that doesn't work in Scotland because it isn't the same government. And so, as it is the evidence of the head of the Civil Service to the House of Lords Committee last year, he said, you know, I do it in a different way, but I still ask the First Minister. So it's an irony, but it seems to work, and that's the thing that that's the impression that I have over the years.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just before I come to Wendy, I just want to return to some of the themes that you raised with Mr. Russ, because I think we're going to hear quite a lot about this in the course of this inquiry, and it's the politics side of it all. And I think in your evidence, Mr. Parry, you came close to just sort of putting it out and suggesting it. This is going to be very complicated for government and how far they might actually go to issue instruction to the civil service in Scotland. And I think that you mentioned that it's not clear what form of that guidance or support might take. Yeah. Is this going to be difficult for the UK government to do? Is it something you think they should be doing, like giving that instructions to the civil service? Or, I mean, I think both of you said this is about a political solution, but a political solution might impact upon the operation of the civil service in Scotland if the UK government does decide to issue an instruction or a message about how civil service in Scotland should operate.
Yes, and this is one of these issues which didn't seem like an issue for a long time, and then it became an issue. So how is it handled? And it seemed that the way it's to be handled is the civil service, through its internal mechanisms, is to issue instructions. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure what form they would take, and I'm not sure how easy it is to draft. I mean, I think part of it is the loose drafting of the Civil Service Code, which just says you are accountable to Scottish ministers, who in turn are accountable to the Scottish Parliament, and that really doesn't leave you much room for manoeuvre. Interesting, the Northern Ireland Civil Service Code of Ethics, which is their version of it, says you are accountable to your minister, who's accountable to the Assembly. But it says all civil servants have a shared responsibility to support the work of the executive as a whole. That's added in Northern Ireland in a way that's not found in GB. And I could sort of see you might add a line saying you must have due regard to the distribution of devolved and reserved responsibilities and so on. But you can see even by drafting it, I don't think that's a route to go down.
It's interesting you mentioned Northern Ireland in that response. Just say, for example, the Northern Irish government is back up under the leadership of a Sinn Féin First Minister. Just say part of that policy becomes the ambition, the name of United Ireland. What should the civil service in Northern Ireland therefore do if that became a more stated objective?
Yes, they do work, of course, on an all-Ireland basis for lots of things, and they're in touch, and they advise their ministers. And I suppose the progress on a Northern Ireland referendum is very much in the hands of the UK government, because there is a legal framework for the Northern Ireland border poll. It's not within the responsibility of the Northern Ireland executives at all. So working on what would happen in a united Ireland, I'm not aware of that being a thing that the Northern Ireland Civil Service is spending lots of time on. I'm just not sure because I haven't researched it for a while. But yeah, but you can sort of see scenarios in which a Northern Ireland situation could raise the same issues that have been raised in Scotland.
Mr. Rycroft, what you think about that view that guidance should be issued to Scottish Government, civil servants?
I was just thinking in other circumstances it might have been my job to try and draft it. And I think I'd have struggled, to be honest. And there is some ambiguity here, and doubtless there will be different legal views about what precisely pertains here. As I made my view clear earlier on, I think there is a problem, but others would maybe argue that there isn't. How do you resolve that problem? As I say, and I started my evidence by saying during my time, this whole question of unified civil service was a bit of a sleeping dog. Actually, this risks poking the sleeping dog with quite a sharp stick. So you make this an issue. You then have one side of the debate saying the Scottish Government is acting ultra vires and we're going to address this by through the civil service route. You have the other side of the debate saying, but we have a democratic mandate to talk to people of Scotland about this, and you have that conflict. That then becomes a political conflict, and out of that might pop a renewed demand for a separate civil service. So it could actually be a counterproductive route to where those who are worrying about this might take. There is ambiguity in every constitution, and sometimes I have in my time recommended sort of masterful inactivity can sometimes be the resolution to a problem, and that might have been the might have been my recommendation here, but clearly it has emerged as a political issue. As I say, my view very strongly is that using the civil service route to resolve it, I think will exacerbate the problem. It won't ultimately solve the problem, and the way to solve it is to think about what is the right democratic approach to the powers of Scottish Government, and if they're found to be wanting in this regard, then ultimately to correct that. But I don't hold out my hopes that'll happen anytime soon.
For that. When did you?
Thanks very much, both. I want to move on to talk a little bit about capability, learning and development aspects in relation to civil service. Now, the first thing was Jack McConnell, when he was here as former First Minister in our other inquiry. He said on the record that he believed that that it should be a requirement for civil servants to basically serve in both devolved administrations and at Whitehall. If I come to you first, Mr. Rycroft, what's your thoughts on that?
I've made a similar argument. I'd expand it a little bit beyond the devolved administrations, but I think, in my view, I think this is really, really important, that if you aspire to be a senior civil servant in the unified civil service, you should be able to demonstrate experience, not just a couple of weeks out doing shadowing somebody, but a good chunk of experience, 2-3 years in a devolved government, in local government, the NHS, business, voluntary sector, somewhere where you can bring a perspective to your job from outside the government machine. I myself worked in the European Commission, but I also did a good stint, 20 months or so, in a major Scottish business. And that was hugely beneficial to me in terms of my understanding of how others see government. But I think from this perspective, having more people who have worked in the Scottish, Welsh or Northern Ireland context, who then pursue their career in Whitehall, would be a very good thing.
And the other sort of criticism that's sort of made from a civil service perspective is that civil servants have to choose from a career path of promotion or expertise. Is that a challenge in this regard?
There is something in that, and it suits some people to specialise, and that's absolutely right. You need specialists, and we probably, in the civil service as a whole, need more specialist people who are saying, no, if you want to understand the modalities of education, of what works in a school context, then you have more people in the house who have that very deep experience. But for your policy makers who are going to be advising successive governments on how to implement their manifestos, you still need those people. Their expertise in is how government works, how legislation functions, how you translate a manifesto commitment into policy that can then actually change lives on the ground. It's those people who should have, as well as accruing some expertise, but they should also have some breadth, and some of that breadth, seeing government from the outside, and a lot of them could benefit, as I said earlier on, from the way in which policy is done in a devolved context. You get a far wider span of responsibility at any particular level than you do in Whitehall, and then you begin to see the joins in policy. You begin to understand how the systems of policy function, and that's a very healthy thing.
And do you concur, Mr. Parry?
I was interested to read Chuck McConnell's observation on that, because he seemed to want to bring back the system which operated before 1997, when they had a very clear view that anyone who would occupy a very senior position in the Scottish office should spend time, particularly in the Cabinet Office or the Treasury, and they often did. And because that was happening to them, it was clear to everybody that they were being regarded as people who might, and that was part of the old, like I would say, the old way of doing things in the civil service.
The thinking is this acknowledgement that 25 years on, whereas, and this has been the political reality as well, that everybody knew everybody in the initial period of devolution, but actually that you can't rely on those relationships anymore, and that's just as true for the civil service as it is for politicians.
Yes, I think that's right. And there's a huge issue about what skills should an applicant for a senior position in the civil service have. And I'm just a little surprised that there is a leadership elite in Scotland, local authority chief executives, health board, chief executives, university people, and so on. And I think many of us kind of thought that would be the group that would occupy senior civil. Now, that's happened to a certain degree, but often what makes a good CV look good, and that will change, I suspect. Now, it might be that saying, look, I've been in the UK civil service, I've been in a government department in Whitehall, and I can bring that with me, and that would be seen as good, and that would be perhaps a little bit of a change from the pattern in recent years where experience in the third sector in business and so on would be seen as the important thing. But I don't think we'll ever get back to the days of career planning, as it were, when there was a sort of long-term route looking 5, 10, 15 years ahead for a keen young civil servant, sorry, the present company, etc., who was working the way up, and they were thinking, first this, then a bit of time in London, then back for this, and then on to that. I think we've seen the end of that. I think it's a very much job thing. The civil service isn't a grade to be occupied, it's a job to be done.
Yes.
Now.
And it sounds like, and I mean, this is true for so many professions now, it's simply become more porous that people don't stay in jobs or organisations or career pathways for 30 years. Is that a risk back to that expertise within the civil service, that we're potentially not keeping people at the lower levels for a period of time?
I think there is certainly a risk there. It's a sort of volatility of turnover in the civil services, I think, way too high, actually on both fronts, from where you want people who do understand climate change policy or health, but whatever it is, but also from the point of view of people who are there to advise ministers on transacting their manifesto and their policy business. That people staying in jobs, I always thought about it takes you about 18 months to get up to sort of cruising altitude, and that's when you're delivering best value, and you ought to stay in a job for 2-3 years beyond that. I think also people's career patterns have changed. I'm glad Richard thinks my career was planned, because it didn't look like that to me. But,
no, I didn't put that very well.
I ran a department in the Department for Exit in the EU, which was a very young department in terms of literal age of the very, very, very good officials that worked in that department. And they had a very different attitude to their careers. They were not looking at being civil servants for 30, 40 years. They were coming in and they would do the more transactional basis. They'll do this while it's interesting, when you give me good challenges. But some of them would saying quite openly, no, my next job will be out. So quite a lot of them would come in from other jobs. So that sort of intermixing, I think, is a very good thing. But in and amongst all of that, as we talked about the UK governance group earlier on, you need a leavening of expertise, both on the experts in particular policy domains, but also the policy profession is a profession. I would also argue that your route into that profession ought to be a professional one. In other words, you ought to understand something about public policy if you aspire to become a public policy professional. So whether you've done an undergraduate degree or a master's degree, or you undertake a programme of training that then gives ministers and the public confidence that you understand the Constitution, public finance, how Parliament works, and all the rest of it. There is, of course, quite a lot of training goes on, but it's not as systematic and as thorough and as grounded as I think it ought to be. And critical amongst that is the understanding of the governance of the United Kingdom. And that's what I, in my personal experience, found wanting when I was thrown into the mix in 2012 to support ministers helping them run one side of the referendum campaign.
In your view, sort of any devolution capability teams within Whitehall, just we're just not getting it right in relation to understanding devolution.
There are some wonderful people in
Of course.
departments, and there lots of them I work with in the devolution teams are very
From a
committed
knowledge
to that.
management perspective.
The risk is that they're the people who do devolution, and they become almost an excuse for the rest of the departments. Well, we don't have to worry about that because they worry about it. And it ought to be a concern for every civil. Just have an understanding.
Yeah.
If you think of where the problems and the tensions generally arise, it's not actually with departments that are dealing with stuff on a day-to-day basis. So I think DEFRA has been deeply inured in this for years and years because of EU policy, where you had to reach a common UK position, and all of these cross-border impacts that carry on in environment, agriculture and fisheries. So they understand it, and there's lots of them. But it's when you have people introducing particularly legislation in reserved areas where they're not actually have a lot of dealings with the devolved governments, that's when you find that they're quite reluctant to share, they forget to share, they forget to consult, and that's when the problems tend to occur.
And it's interesting because we've also been sort of looking at intergovernmental relations in previous inquiries, that with the new structure coming in 2022, actually reviewing the groups that have met, it's exactly the groups, it's exactly the departments that you've just mentioned who haven't met at all. And actually the argument should be that they should be over-indexing in that space.
You can map it pretty much. And the other point about all of this, of course, is that one of the things that really hasn't happened as much as it should have done post-devolution is that you have this real-time policy experiment going on. You've got different policies being driven by different governments, with similar populations in socio-economic terms. And there is far too little of that sort of common. Why are you going down that? What's your learning from that, whether it's in education policy, health policy, economic development, where it may? And it is, I think, something that has been, that we simply haven't done enough of that since devolution, and it's a real missed opportunity.
So Barry, where does the Scotland office sit in all this?
And where does the role of Secretary of State for Scotland sit in all this? It's probably the most interesting thing.
We've had, as part of our 25 years since devolution inquiry, we've had a former Secretary of State for Scotland who said, scrap the role of the Secretary of State for Scotland. It should be a one minister for the nation. They kind of
tried, of course, in the early years under Blair and Tony Blair. He did merge the job with other jobs, so for a while that they were holding other jobs. I mean, it's a curious job, which has been in the UK cabinet for 150 years almost, and the idea was we would have civil servants in Whitehall who would be the Whitehall face of Scotland, but then immediately in the first post-devolution Secretary of State, John Reid, he wanted a real job to do, and he was building offices in Glasgow and intervening in, rescues to prove that the UK government, even though it was his own government in Scotland, which is a very unexpected thing. I shouldn't stray into the Conservatives, but, if you've only got one MP in Scotland and have to find a Secretary of State for Scotland, that can be a bit of a difficult issue as well. I think much the best route, as Philip was suggesting, was to merge all the capabilities into the one thing, have a UK government group. The recommendation of Andrew Dunlop's review was to have a big guy, a Secretary of State for Intergovernmental Relations, a fourth alongside the three great officers of state. What has happened is we've had Michael Gove as an individual, who's become the minister, and in a way, because he is from Scotland and he can operate collegially in some ways.
The Prime Minister is Minister of the Union.
Well, that was just a slogan, I would suspect, more than anything else. Clearly, the Prime Minister is always the Minister for the whole of the UK in that sense. So I'm not sure, but it didn't ever become a big organisational entity because it always drew some personnel from the devolved system. It never tried to run an independent operation for its own personnel. So that might have been quite useful. Philip would have some thoughts on this probably. And I suspect we need to have it there, but much the bigger need is for a general understanding around Whitehall. And I would say everyone joining the senior civil service in Whitehall should be compelled to spend one day each in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast just to physically relate to the guy who's doing their kind of work in the devolved system. And so that at least they've been there. At the moment, it's a very hit and miss. Some people have visited the places, are very interested in the places, are up to speed with what's going on in the devolved nations. Some people aren't interested at all, and it's very unpredictable.
And sadly not interested until maybe
they
need to be, and then it's too late.
So I think that the Secretary of State of Scotland, that those jobs should be maintained. I think they're really important. I do agree with Andrew Dunlop. I think they should be, in a sense, reporting to a first Secretary of State in the Cabinet Office. The UK Governance Group notice I work for 3 Cabinet Ministers, so Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for Wales, and the Cabinet Office Minister. That was perfectly comfortable with that. It is really important that people in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland see that there is somebody speaking on their behalf in Cabinet, and it's really important in Whitehall that that voice is heard as well. I had the privilege of sitting behind the Deputy Prime Minister in many Cabinet meetings through the coalition time, and knowing that the Secretary of State for Scotland could come in on the debates around what the UK government was doing on the referendum, and so it was hugely important. So I think even though the offices perforce are going to be quite small, but they do have an influence in Whitehall that is way above their sort of physical size, and that is really because they have a Secretary of State to lead them. I think it would be a retrograde step to abolish those offices. I think there is an argument that one of the mistakes probably made in early devolution time was not to give them a substantial programme budget, where they have money to deploy to encourage collaborative working, where they can put money into reserve policy space to join up with Scottish or Welsh government in devolved policy space to make interesting things happen on the lines of the city deals, which had to be sort of invented.
Or indeed levelling up funding, which is obviously
exactly. So that you encourage that sort of collaborative working to mutual benefit. But those offices remain an important part of our constitutional makeup. It's a bit asymmetrical, of course, but that's the nature of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, just a final cheeky question. Would a more federal approach make things easier?
Well, we looked at this very carefully, of course, in the Welsh Constitution Commission context. In some respects, yes, it would, because it would clarify the boundaries. Where you draw those boundaries, of course, would be up for negotiation. But one of the attractions of a federal option is that it would require the centre to change its mindset, because you would have, in a sense, an equalisation of powers. At the moment, devolution is all, essentially, it's granted from this place, and it could, in theory, be taken back with in a short bill going through Parliament here. And that sort of sets the tone of the relationship.
And also where the politics come in, because you're working on that basis of trust that pen won't be.
So one of the things that I've argued for in the way that intergovernmental relations is transacted, was in the civil service as well as subsequently, is that it has to be done on the basis of respect and essentially parity of esteem. Federalism would, in a sense, push you into that space, whether you like it or not, and it would oblige Whitehall to change in a way that Whitehall has not really changed since devolution. Is it going to happen? No, and not least because of the problems of sorting out England. And England, it's the other dog that never barks in these debates, or certainly not loud enough, but that's a completely different, not your remit.
Thank you very much.
I was wanting to let you gentlemen leave by 4 o'clock, but it's been quite a fascinating session, even though there's only the 3 of us here. But there's just a couple of quick questions that I want to ask, just for part of this inquiry, and it's I'll ask one of you each of them, if that's okay. So to you, Mr. Rycroft, the UK government has relocated some 2,000 officials to Scotland under its Places for Growth scheme. What effect do you think this might have on the civil service and the operation and cooperation between the two governments?
It's a good. There always have been a lot of UK or civil servants working for UK government departments located in Scotland, HMRC and the rest of it, and ditto in Wales, which is a good thing, of course, because those jobs should not be based here. And people tend to forget it's a very small, relatively small proportion of the civil service overall that works out of Whitehall. The important thing about those jobs going to, whether it's to Scotland or to Darlington or to Swansea, wherever it be, is that senior jobs go with them. And there's lots of operational jobs out there. Those are hugely important jobs. They actually keep the country functioning. But to be meaningful, you have to move senior policy jobs out Whitehall and allow people to develop career structures further Whitehall, whether that's in the North East or in Scotland or elsewhere. And that's where you'll get the real benefits, because don't forget, those folk are then talking to their colleagues back down here and saying, it's not like that in Cumbernauld.
That does seem to be happening. We visited Queen Elizabeth House recently. I think we're really impressed just by the placement of UK civil servants from all the Whitehall departments, and there did seem to be senior managers coming with them. Yeah.
The fact you've got that building there, when I was looking after the Scotland office, it was tucked away in Melville Crescent, and it was not a building you could put many more folk in. So having that very visible presence and giving people the sense, okay, there is a career structure, and I can work for the Treasury or for the Department for Business or whoever it may be, the Home Office, and I can make my mark as a policy civil servant and see a track for my career. I think that's a very good thing.
And just to you, Mr. Parry, I mean, there's a number of policy areas which now are devolved and reserved, thinking possibly social security and issues to do around transport increasingly. Is this a good thing for working together across Parliament? And is it a good thing for civil servants to be able to work with colleagues on areas of mutual interest?
You can end up with a situation in which you find it no easier to draw the boundary between what's devolved and what's reserved within each area, and of course it's of great significance that the Scottish Government has now moved into the social security area in a big way after the Smith Commission, because it is handing out lots of money actually, and this adds to the constraint. Devolution worked quite well because it wasn't in the taxing and benefits area for a long time. It just kept away from that. It could do many other things. It's now into income tax, of course, hugely, and it's now into social security. And generally speaking, the operationalisation of this is after Smith, after the Scotland Act 2016, has gone quite well, given the issues involved, it seems to me. The social security.
Do you think officials help sort of...
Completely, because they need to work together. Of course, HMRC is now serving as a single delivery agency for income tax, working to two administrations. Now, that route has not been adopted with work and pensions, because, frankly, of the attitudes towards social security of Conservative administrations, basically, and that made it quite simple for the Scottish Government to say, no, we don't really want them to be doing it. We want to do it our way, and we will have a distinctive way of working on it. So I think there are many, many issues there about the generosity of benefits. If you have a lot of benefit payments, it preempts everything else to a certain degree, but it is an example of devolution at work, and probably it's kind of under-researched what happened after 2016, you know, the irony of the 2014 referendum was that a regime with much more devolution, which everyone thought should have been put to a referendum, it wasn't even put to a referendum, but it happened.
Douglas Ross has got a quick question.
Just very briefly, I mean, some of the issues that exist with Social Security Scotland still have to be resolved, and it is not all plain sailing as a result of that.
Agreed.
But also the Scottish Government had to hand some of these powers back because it wasn't equipped and ready to introduce them when they envisaged. So I just think, for clarity, you know, it has not all been, you know, plain sailing and effective as people would have wanted, given that some of the powers had to even be returned.
I absolutely agree that it didn't go very smoothly. Compared with what anyone who had done any research on social security, because it was clear it was not going to be easy. It was going to be very, very difficult with so many benefits in Scotland being administered from England and requiring to be assessed personally, and that it was going to be very, very difficult always. And the fact that it seems to have been happening and it wasn't just totally unworkable, to me is I would see as a reasonable achievement, but that's simply because anyone who's ever looked at social security knows what a hard area it is, and of course it would make sense to have a single agency in that way, you know, but that wasn't the route that was chosen.
Mr. Rycroft wants to come in on that?
Yeah, very quickly. We came under quite a lot of pressure in 2016 as we were taking after the Scotland Act went through to get these things pushed out to Scotland very, very quickly. It's actually taken a lot longer, and it's been a lot more expensive to establish those arrangements than I think anybody predicted at the time. It is worth going back to the rationale for what went into that Act, both on tax and welfare. And this was, in the view of the government at the time, very clearly almost trying to complete the devolution settlement. Because you had a parliament that didn't have the wherewithal. It had the tax raising power, but it was a very it was a very constrained one. It didn't have any welfare powers, but was very critical of welfare policy at UK level. Give it the powers to raise money and spend powers on welfare if that's what it wished to do, subject, of course, to persuading the people of Scotland to keep voting for it. So, from that point of view, I think, as Richard said, this is actually now beginning to percolate through into political consciousness. Don't forget that soon after those powers came in, we had the big distraction of Brexit, but as we're getting through that, I think the political debate in Scotland should be enriched by the fact that the Scottish Government can now, I'm a Scottish taxpayer, taxes me more than I would be if I was living south of the border, but by the same token, it can deliver those greater welfare benefits to people in Scotland. Absolutely right, the devolved Parliament should be able to do that. And so from that point of view, I think that's credit to the Smith Commission and the government and the government of Scotland for putting those powers in place.
On that note, thank you both ever so much for helping us out today. I think we've got this inquiry off to a flying start, and certainly lots for us to digest as we go forward this inquiry. If there's anything else that you feel you could usefully contribute, please get in touch with this committee for this afternoon. Thank you for attending this committee. Order, order.